Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Burges Watson. You are watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump showcase starkly different visions for the US in their first and only debate before the presidential election. The top US and UK diplomats are in Ukraine in a show of support for the war-torn country as Russia advances on the city of Pokrovsk. And as the death toll continues to rise in Gaza and the West Bank, the Israeli defense minister now says his forces will shift their focus to the northern border with Lebanon. A very warm welcome. There are just 8 weeks to go now until the US presidential election, and in a matter of days, early voting will begin in some US states. Well, last night, the Democratic candidate Kamala Harris and her Republican rival Donald Trump had what will in all likelihood be their one and only opportunity to make their case before a television audience of tens of millions of voters. Well, that highly anticipated presidential debate wasn't just watched by American voters, but by people right across the world. And today, people have been dissecting their performance. Well, immigration, foreign policy and healthcare were all discussed, but the debate also got rather personal. Harris delivered blistering attacks on Trump's fitness for office, and she cited the fact that senior Republicans had done the same thing.
You talk about extreme. This is, I think, one of the reasons why in this election I actually have the endorsement of 200 Republicans who have formerly worked with President Bush, Mitt Romney, and John McCain, including the endorsement of former Vice President Dick Cheney and Congress member Liz Cheney. His former Secretary of Defense has said the nation, the Republic, would never survive another Trump term. And when we listen to this kind of rhetoric, when the issues that affect the American people are not being addressed, I think the choice is clear in this election.
Kamala Harris speaking there. Well, for his part, Donald Trump lambasted Harris and labeled her a Marxist.
Everything that she believed 3 years ago and 4 years ago is out the window. She's going to my philosophy now. In fact, I was going to send her a MAGA hat. She's gone to my philosophy. But if she ever got elected, she'd change it. And it will be the end of our country. She's a Marxist. Everybody knows she's a Marxist. Her father's a Marxist professor in economics, and he taught her well.
Donald Trump speaking there. Well, let's get the latest now. We can cross to Washington and speak to our correspondent, Benji Haya, who joins us now. Benji, welcome to the program. First up, I'd like to know what the pundits are saying about just who came out on top last night.
Well, this is a feature of American presidential debates, is the moment that the two candidates step off the stage, there is a compelling effort within the spin room by both sides, including, in fact, Donald Trump in person when he turned up shortly afterwards, to try to give their own narrative, to try to convince the media and those pundits watching that their side came out on top. But I think the very fact that Donald Trump felt inclined to turn up personally in that spin room, contrast that with Kamala Harris, who went off to a separate watch party / rally. I think that is indicative of how his side might feel in the way that it's gone for the former president. And indeed, Kamala Harris's team calling already for a second debate, illustrative of the fact that they feel that she performed very strongly against Donald Trump and that she managed to get under his skin, that the big topics on which the Harris campaign may have been vulnerable, the economy and immigration, instead was dominated by Trump making baseless conspiracy theories about migrants eating pets or false claims about the Democrats wanting to kill, exterminate, execute babies babies even after they are born. And I think that will be one of the main takeaways for Kamala Harris. And yes, she is tainted perhaps by the Biden administration's failures on foreign policy. Donald Trump saying, you've got all this plan that you want to do economically. Why haven't you done it already? You've had the opportunity. But Harris, on the other hand, can turn around and say this is a chance to move forward, to not look back on the past and to really lay out a vision for the future.
Yeah, Benji, we're going to come back to that quote about the pets being eaten in Springfield in just a moment. But I just want to ask you what stood out for you as being the knockout punches during the course of those 90 minutes?
I think there were many key topics that American voters will be paying attention to, the likes of the economy or immigration that always list as their top priorities. But ultimately, what stole the limelight were a couple of comments that Donald Trump made, separate from those allegations of eating pets that you mentioned. Number one is the stance on abortion. He refused to commit to vetoing a nationwide abortion plan, whilst Kamala Harris used that moment to express her support for a woman's right to choose. Additionally, Donald Trump was asked whether he acknowledged that he lost the election in 2020. He, of course, had faced criminal charges for those efforts to subvert democracy, to overturn the result of that vote that he lost. In response, he said, no, I don't acknowledge that loss at all, which opened the door, perhaps, for Kamala Harris to reach out to those undecided voters and say that if you ultimately believe in democracy, if you believe in the rule of law, then I am your candidate.
Benji, we've been saying in the last couple of days that voters in the United States have been saying they don't feel like they really know much about Kamala Harris. They don't feel like they know her in the same way that US households know Donald Trump, who is a well-known entity, not just there, but across the world. But do you think this perception of not knowing Kamala Harris has now changed as a result of last night's debate?
Well, she's had some opportunity to lay out her economic plan, to create an opportunity economy, as she calls it. The issue that she faces is twofold. One, that she is connected, entwined with what the Biden administration has done. And for many Americans, they don't approve of the current economic state of the country. And the other is that on many issues, she has kind of flip-flopped. She has changed her position, changed her stance, most notably on the topic of fracking, which goes to the very heart of America's energy policy, America's place in the world vis-a-vis climate change. And I think she's struggling to navigate that. Now, last night, she set out her stall to voters and said, I very clearly have not changed in my values, but I think the Trump campaign will still want to highlight that she has changed on many issues. That is not to say that the former president hasn't done so himself. On issues like abortion, his stance has been very unclear as well. And whilst policies are important, personality is too, vibes key. It's not the thing that's going to necessarily win elections single-handedly, but one of the main takeaways from this debate will not just be what's said, but also the body language of both candidates, how they presented themselves to the American people. Trump's sort of aggressive positioning that he took, his scowling, cutting a figure of fury, versus Kamala Harris, who tried to maintain her composure in the face of the former president's attacks.
Yeah, you're right. The body language is incredible. It would have been even quite interesting to watch the debate without the volume on. But just lastly, and briefly, if you will, what stood out for you as being the most memorable quote or moment, rightly or wrongly, from last night's debate?
Well, I think we've got to hark back to what we touched upon at the top, which was the topic of immigration. Again, this is really where Donald Trump is strongest, frankly. He, rose to prominence during the 2016 campaign with his policy to build the wall along the Mexican border. And this was a chance for him to really hammer the vice president, who has, in some capacity, had the responsibility of overseeing the issue of abortion, instead reverting back to those conspiracy theories, which allowed Kamala Harris to paint him as extreme, as weird. And so I don't think he really landed those blows that he needed to on that one subject. And instead, the memes that are going viral are all about that baseless allegation that he made, very strange allegation, that Haitian migrants were coming into the country and eating people's pets.
Benji, let's take a listen to what Donald Trump actually said. Let's take a listen.
What they have done to our country by allowing these millions and millions of people to come into our country, and look at what's happening to the towns all over the United States. And a lot of towns don't want to talk. It's not going to be Aurora or Springfield. A lot of towns don't want to talk about it because they're so embarrassed by it. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country.
Okay, Donald Trump speaking there in the debate last night. We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Benji Hire, our correspondent in Washington. Thank you so much.
Donald Trump was fired by 81 million people.
What they have done to our country by allowing these millions and millions of people to come into our country, crime here is up and through the roof.
Well, I think this is so rich, coming from someone who has been prosecuted for national security crimes.
I felt the Vice President did a better job in explaining her plan for us.
Well, I think Donald Trump was a little bit more demure in terms of what we've seen in the past.
And remember this, she is Biden. You know, she's trying to get away from Biden.
Clearly, I am not Joe Biden, and I am certainly not Donald Trump.
You've seen the same act over and over again by Trump. It's like a child that is being told no.
His temperament's a lot calmer. He hasn't been as aggressive as he was in the past.
I feel like they're both not the right candidate for me, based on this debate and the past debate.
Well, staying with the US election, shortly after last night's TV debate, the singer Taylor Swift announced that she's going to be endorsing Kamala Harris. Observers say this is the most potentially significant celebrity endorsements that a US politician could ask for. 34-year-old Taylor Swift has one of the largest online followings in the world. She's estimated to have upwards of 500 million followers across all social media platforms. Well, within 15 minutes of her announcement on Instagram, it had more than 1 million likes. On Tuesday, the Kremlin said that President Putin would be unlikely to watch last night's presidential debate. Well, today, the Russian president's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said that Moscow had not appreciated how Putin's name had been bandied around in the debate, and he urged the two candidates to stop dragging him into their political fight. Well, Russian state television described that debate last night as, quote, emotional. Well, last week, President Putin said in a teasing remark that he favored Harris over Trump. The ongoing war in Ukraine was a key theme in last night's presidential debate. And with that in mind, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy paid a visit to Kyiv today. They've been discussing Ukraine's request for long-range missiles. Well, the Kremlin has warned of a strong response to any Ukrainian strikes within Russian territory, highlighting the risks of escalating the conflict. Well, for more on this, I'm joined from Kyiv by Yuri Sak, who is an advisor to Ukraine's Minister for Strategic Industries and a former spokesperson for the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. Thank you so much for joining us here. What was the significance of this visit, do you think, by the top diplomats of the United States and the UK?
Good evening. In 2 days, President Zelensky will be in Washington, D.C., then in New York, and he'll be meeting with President Biden, and they will continue the discussion that has been ongoing for some time now. And of course, the significance of today's meeting is, very important because every time such high guests from our strategic partners like the United States and the United Kingdom come to Kyiv, it sends a signal primarily to the enemy, primarily to Russia. It sends a signal that our partners will stand with Ukraine. Our partners will not budge into this fear-mongering that Russia is engaged in. And, it gives hope also to the Ukrainian people because we see our friends standing with us.
Secretary of State Blinken suggested that long-range weaponry could be given to Ukraine and we presume then used against Russia. I mean, what's been agreed on that particular issue?
At the moment, this is work in progress. We have made our case very clearly to our partners why we need those long-range capabilities, because Russia continues to terrorize Ukraine on a daily basis. Actually, right now, there is an air raid siren, and people in Kyiv and other cities in Ukraine, they are rushing towards bomb shelters because we've just been warned that there is a ballistic missiles attack ongoing. So we have explained to our partners that, for us to be able to stop this terror, we need, in addition to our capabilities on the front lines, we need the ability to disable, incapacitate Russia's war machine where we can reach it. So Russian airfields from which these bombers take off, Russian launching sites from which they launch ballistic and other types of missiles and drones. So this is very obvious. We need those long-range capabilities simply to protect our people from being terrorized by the terrorist state Russia.
But isn't there a real risk here of a major escalation in the conflict? That's what Russia's warning.
Russia has been banking on fear for a very long time, and every time Ukraine would receive a new type of weapon system from our partners, we have all seen that, these mythical red lines have been crossed and nothing happens. So, we have received tanks, we have received multi-launch rocket systems, we have received Patriot systems, we have received now F-16s, and each time this was a hypothetical red line which Russia warned everybody not to cross. So we think that, for us, or for all of us, for the coalition of free nations to help Ukraine win this war in which we are fighting for the values and stability of all of us, we need to stop being afraid of Russia talking about these red lines, and we need to equip the Ukrainian army with the tools that will help us finish the job.
And Yuri, just before we finish, just tell us what the latest is that you're hearing about the situation on the front line in the east of Ukraine.
The situation on the eastern front of Ukraine has been stabilized in recent days. Our commander-in-chief has reported that the advancements of the Russian troops have been slowed down by the Ukrainian defense forces, and we are doing all we need to do to stop them from advancing further, and we are focused on bolstering and strengthening our defenses.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Yuri Isak, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's get a brief check of some other stories we're following for you here on Al Arabiya. Vietnamese media has reported that 179 people have been killed due to Typhoon Yagi, which hit the north of the country during the weekend. Several communities are being cut off by the flooding and supplies are being delivered by boat. Around 145 people are still unaccounted for in the country. Up to 1 million people have been affected by severe flooding in northern Nigeria's Borno state. Well, the flooding was triggered by severe rainfall, and that caused a dam to overflow. Well, and amidst the devastation, a state-owned safari park has been flooded, and that washed crocodiles, snakes, and other dangerous animals into the water, and that poses a risk for communities. And students in India's Manipur province are demanding an end to the violence in the region. Manipur has seen continuing ethnic tensions in recent months, which has at times turned deadly. Well, internet and mobile services have been suspended for 5 days now, and there's been an indefinite curfew imposed in some areas of that province.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics, and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake, and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
We're going to turn now to the latest in Gaza, where it's been reported that an Israeli airstrike hit a school today. This happened in Nuseirat, which is in central Gaza. Well, according to Hamas, 14 people, amongst them women and children, were killed there at the school, which is being used to house displaced people. Well, Israel says it was targeting militants there. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Red Crescent says at least 5 people were killed in an Israeli strike in the West Bank earlier today. That happened in the northern city of Tubas. Well, Israel says it was targeting militant groups in that area, but gave no further details. Meanwhile, on Israel's northern border with Lebanon, there's been fresh violence in the last 24 hours. The Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has indicated that his forces will be shifting their focus to that northern border area with Lebanon.
מרכז הכובד עובר צפונה. אנחנו לקראת השלמת המשימות שלנו בדרום, אבל יש לנו כאן משימה
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by military analyst Sean Bell. Thank you so much for joining us here on Al Arabiya News. The Israeli Defense Minister, we just saw a brief clip of him there, has indicated that attentions are now going to shift to the northern border. He says, mission nearly accomplished in Gaza. Does that sound credible to you?
Well, like all these things, I think there's a whiff of truth in that. But actually, what the headlines really are that there are negotiations ongoing at the moment looking to how do you bring the conflict to an end, ceasefire. And I think Antony Blinken announced just the other day that 90% of the work was done. If that deal isn't done, then Hezbollah and the Houthis and Hamas will try to fire up more action planned by Iran. And as a result, it's pretty clear what Israel's doing now is bolstering its defences in the north in preparation, A, to act as a deterrence for Hezbollah launching any further attack, but also making sure they're ready should that day happen.
OK, so we might be looking, therefore, at a real escalation on both sides of the northern border, therefore.
I'm not sure that's true. I think at the core of the dangers, we keep reporting on symptoms. The actual disease here is that at the start of the conflict, Prime Minister Netanyahu made 2 priorities: to destroy Hamas and to free the hostages. But it's been pretty clear for the last 11 months where his priority has laid. Now, with the military action largely over in the Gaza, it's still ongoing, but on a much lower level. Inevitably, questions are looking at how to free the hostages. And frankly, the only way to get the hostages out is through negotiation. Back in November last year, over 100 were freed with a ceasefire. Since then, 8 have been freed through military action, but huge numbers have been killed through military action. Most recently, 6, tragically, when the IDF tried to launch a rescue operation. And what Hamas is doing clearly is saying that if you try to rescue them by military force, they'll be killed. Therefore, there has to be a negotiated solution. Now, Netanyahu clearly doesn't want to make peace with Hamas just yet. Therefore, he's covering his bases by making sure that the northern axis to Hezbollah is protected, whilst also negotiating. But whether we'll see a lasting peace or not, I think the jury's still out.
So, I mean, it doesn't sound as though you think that a broader regional conflict is therefore the necessary, the likely turn of events as we move forward.
No, I think there's been, inevitably, it's a tinderbox in the region, but you only have to look back. Lebanon does not want to see another big war. It has already been devastated. It's got huge debts. It's got huge problems domestically. Hezbollah knows that it will get an incredibly bloody nose were its take on the Israeli Defense Forces, which are by far and away the most dominant military power in the region. But everybody is being, certainly the 3 H's, Hezbollah, Hamas and the Houthis, are being funded and supported and prompted by Iran Iran that wants to see Hamas emerge from these negotiations, survived and potentially still in some sort of power. So the stakes are very high, but it doesn't feel like any of the major players actually want this to escalate. But they clearly want to do a bit of brinkmanship to put pressure on those negotiations to try to make sure that Hamas at least stays in some form in Gaza, which of course is pretty clear Israel does not want that at all. And why I'm a little bit cynical, frankly, about the negotiations is they only work if both sides see benefit in doing so. At the moment, neither side has won. They're not at a stalemate, and the sort of compromises that Israel would have to make, it's pretty clear Prime Minister Netanyahu has no appetite for that at the moment.
Josep Borrell is visiting southern Lebanon right now. Is that a significant visit, do you think? And what's that likely to achieve?
I think there's a lot of political pressure going on at the moment to try to stop the war escalating. I mean, the one thing, my attention is less on Hezbollah, quite frankly, and more on Iran. You'll remember the assassination that took place well over a month ago now, that Iran vowed retaliation. And we've waited several weeks. That hasn't happened. And therefore, we fully expected in a matter of weeks that that would happen. Last time Iran retaliated, there were literally hundreds of missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles heading Israel's way. That felt a massive escalation. Now, Israel's kept its powder dry so far, and therefore it does appear to be that we'll have to wait and see the outcome of these negotiations. But there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes at the moment to try to calm the waters. But there's also a lot of big military presence, 2 US carrier groups in the region, 1 US submarine that's got a massive potential launching cruise missiles. There is a lot of military power in the region, which acts as a deterrent, but could end up having a pretty significant response should things get out of control.
Just lastly, supposing the Israelis let the Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar, out of Gaza, what do you think they'd get in return? What would they be asking for in return if they were to do such a thing?
I think that's a really good question because, frankly, although Israel says it's the destruction of Hamas there as their objective, as a military guy, you know, that's an ideal Hamas. You can take out Yahya Sinwar, but Hamas is like a hydra. You chop off one head, another will emerge. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's less about the people and more about things like the Philadelphia corridor, which Israel moved into, because they've got to stop Hamas arming themselves. It's quite difficult for them to do that through the Mediterranean. It's very difficult to do it through the border with Israel. But the border with Egypt has traditionally been a way that Hamas has brought most of its arms and through smuggling. And therefore, that's why Prime Minister Netanyahu's put such an effort there. So I do think there's a lot at stake at the moment here. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, the other complication is clearly he's trying to maintain his grip on power as well. I think the next couple of weeks will be very interesting, both from a political perspective, but also militarily.
OK, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Really interesting there. Military analyst Sean Bell, thank you very much indeed. A couple of business news stories we're keeping an eye on for you here. The Reuters news agency is reporting that Samsung could be on track to cut up to 30% of the company's overseas workforce. The South Korea-based company, which is the world's top maker of smartphones, TVs and memory chips, hasn't yet made a formal announcement on this matter, but is reported to be aiming to reduce the global headcount and improve efficiency. Workers at Kenya's main international airport went on strike today, causing travel misery with numerous delays and cancellations. Unions say the industrial action is in opposition to plans for the airport in Nairobi to be leased to the Indian company, the Adani Group. Well, this, the unions say, would result in job losses and the importation of non-Kenyan workers. The British government says that Jordanian citizens can no longer obtain electronic travel authorization for visits to the UK. Instead, they'll have to apply for a visa. In a statement, London said the reason for this decision was multiple cases of Jordanian citizens misusing their ETA and engaging activities outside of the rules. Let's get a reminder of our top stories here on Al Arabiya News. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump showcase starkly different visions for the United States in their first and only debate before the presidential election. The top US and UK diplomats visit Ukraine in a show of support for the war-torn country as Russia advances on the city of Pokrovsk. And as the death toll continues to rise in Gaza and the West Bank, the Israeli defense minister says his forces are now going to shift their focus to the northern border with Lebanon. That is all we have time for. Coming up next is the Riz Khan Show, and at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, do join Rosanna Lockwood for Global News Today. That's a roundup of top international news with exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from decision makers across the globe, including Kamala Harris's biographer Dan Moraine in the hot seat today.